Welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation with a changemaker working to accelerate the transition to a sustainable, carbon-neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Climate change. It's serious, disturbing, and with the growing frequency of extreme weather, record-breaking heat domes, droughts, and even the evidence we can see in our own backyards, it has become impossible to ignore. But today we're going to try to laugh about it a little bit with Yoram Bauman, the world's only stand-up economist and author with illustrator Grady Klein of The Cartoon Introduction to Climate Change. The book was just re-released in a second edition by Island Press. And we'll include a link to that in the article that accompanies the podcast. He also co-created the Cartoon Introduction to Economics, to Calculus, and to Digital Ethics. So let's get the stand-up version of climate change and talk about how to bring more people into the dialogue about making changes that will stop and eventually reverse global warming. You can learn more about Yoram and watch his videos at standupeconomist.com. Stand-up economist is all one word, no dashes, no spaces. Hello, welcome to the show, Yoram. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Mitch.
Well, thank you for joining us. Before we start, I want to ask, what inspired you to tell the story of climate change in cartoon form?
Well, partly my co-author, Grady Klein, the illustrator, and I had worked on a couple of cartoon books about economics and had such a great time. We were looking for another subject to work on, and climate change is one of my passions, and I've been involved in carbon tax ballot measures and things like that. And it also seems like a subject that a lot of folks, kind of like economics, a lot of folks would like to know more about, but are sort of, a little hesitant to pick up a 300-page tome by Bill McKibben and get all bummed out. So it seemed like the cartoon format was kind of a good, accessible way to bring people into this subject.
I really enjoyed it, and it was both illuminating and engaging in ways that I haven't seen those 300-page tomes achieve. So congratulations on that. But then the other question is, you have a PhD in economics and you are a stand-up economist. How does comedy change the way people access and think about these complex ideas? What can we learn from how you tell this story?
Well, I do actually make a living doing stand-up comedy about economics, believe it or not. And mostly I do colleges and corporate events. And, the college shows are college shows, but the corporate events are not the Sierra Club audience, So this is like the Florida Bankers Association and trucking executives on the banks of the Arkansas River and things like this. What I've kind of learned from doing comedy professionally for 10 years is that if you make people laugh for 35 or 40 minutes, then you can kind of talk to them about anything you want for 5 or 10 minutes, and they'll give you the time of day. Like, they may not agree with you, but at least they'll listen. And so comedy is a way of, I think, opening hearts and minds. And it's a way of making a connection with the audience, because otherwise, climate change books and discussions and lectures, they can get kind of preachy, where you're identifying this problem and suggesting that people need to change how they live their lives, and there can be a lot of pushback from that, and so comedy is kind of a way to establish some common ground and some humanity. And for me, I do some self-deprecating comedy, so it can kind of takes me off of the kind of the quote-unquote pedestal, and it's kind of, so it's accessible, and then it's engaging, like with college crowds or student groups. There's nothing that makes people want to learn something more than having other people around them laughing at something and they don't understand what you're laughing at, and so that makes you want to learn about, pick your subjects in climate change or economics.
Well, so let's turn to the book. You basically do a history of the Earth and how we got here. And you do a great job of summarizing, in other words, shorthanding all of this history. But one of the things that I came away thinking about is the fact that everybody shorthands very complex ideas all the time. And that is often why you end up with very simple but contrary explanations and no middle ground between those explanations where a dialogue can happen. How do you, in a nutshell, summarize climate change when you're just trying to have a conversation with somebody and even find out where they are in order to begin a dialogue?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that the book is kind of subtle about, the cartoon climate change book, I think, is that it does go through sort of this whole history of the Earth before it gets to the quote unquote politically charged subjects, and the reason it does that, it's a little bit of a slow start, kind of slow burn, if you will, but it allows us to cover a bunch of important topics without getting people's political red flags raised. And so we get to talk about, like what caused the ice ages, and we get to talk about the carbon cycle, but we get to talk about those things in a way that's separate from political controversy. And so I think it's important. One of the things we tried to do with the book was sort of try to find as much common ground as we could, mm-hmm, before we get to the stuff that we might get some pushback on. So, like everybody's on board with the dinosaurs and the ice ages and things like that. And so we use that as a way to build up a knowledge base and a set of common ground before starting to talk about anthropogenic climate change.
Well, and you also go into one of the big catching points or sticking points for a lot of people who particularly deniers focus on this issue. And that is how science works. And you explain the scientific method and the fact that it is always evolving towards higher fidelity measurements and explanations of the phenomenon that we are surrounded by. But that's used against climate science. So when you're in a conversation, or maybe you're doing a show and somebody is in a denier mode and they point out that the science isn't perfect, what's your response?
So I'll tell you one thing I don't do. I tend not to say like, oh, 99% of scientists, say this. Like, I haven't found that to be a terribly effective argument with folks who are on the skeptical side of things. One thing that I have found to be effective is to talk about, ultimately the best test of a scientific theory like the theory of anthropogenic global warming is you're basically predicting the future, right? You're saying, hey, if we continue to emit CO2, then here's what we think global temperatures are going to do. And we've now been around this theory for enough decades that we actually have the data. And so so I point that out. I say, look, here's, what people said in the 70s, the scientists said in the 70s about global temperatures. And here's what's happened to global temperatures. If you happen to not believe global temperature data, then there's all sorts of other data about, bird migrations and plant flowerings and things like this. And then I mentioned to them that I made a bet with a fellow economist, actually, back in 2014, when, this is ancient history, but there was this idea of something called the pause in global temperatures. Right. And there was this idea that climate scientists didn't really know what they were talking about, and temperatures were flatlining. And this fellow economist asked me if I wanted to make a bet about this. And I said, sure. And so we bet about what would happen with global temperatures between 2015 and 2030. So the betting period is not over. But as my toddler son likes to say, I'm smoking him. Global temperatures have in fact continued to rise roughly in line with the projections of climate science. And at the end of the day, if folks are not going to believe that, then I encourage them to make a bet with me. Let's get on that bandwagon.
I'm glad you're winning your bet. I just wish it wasn't the case that the bet was being won.
Yes.
So you also, one of the ideas that you talk about in the book, and this is also another one that is sometimes bent into the wrong shape, and that's the notion of the Milankovitch cycle, which is, it describes the orientation of the Earth relative to the sun and how that has contributed to glacial periods and so forth. But you also make very clear that it's different this time. What are Milankovitch cycles in a nutshell, and how is it different?
Great question. Yeah. So one of the big scientific challenges of the 19th century was scientists had figured out that there had been ice ages, right? There were these giant rocks that had been moved from one place to another, and they could only have been transported by glaciers. And so there was all this evidence of glaciation. Mm-hmm. And the question was why? And ultimately the answer was solved by this fellow Milankovitch, who is a Serb, who did a bunch of calculations while he was in a prisoner of war camp during World War I. And there are these subtle variations in the Earth's orbit around the sun. So changes in the degree of the eccentricity. And then the one that we focus on in the book is the the tilt of the Earth changes over tens of thousands of years. If it's more tilted, then that means that summers and winters are stronger. If it's less tilted, then it means that summers and winters are weaker. And ultimately, those changes in the Earth's orbit around the sun drive these drive the changes in solar radiation that leads the Earth to go into and come out of ice ages, over hundreds of thousands of years. And so explain, like, the ice ages, of course, are one of the things that people bring up, like, well, the climate has always changed, so how do we know that this time is different? Right. And part of it is just like the time frame, right? We're talking about changes now over decades, whereas the ice ages were changes over 120,000 years, those kinds of time periods. And then we also have there's strong evidence that, well, we know that CO2 concentrations are rising. We have very strong evidence, theories suggesting that if CO2 concentrations rise, that's going to increase global temperatures, things like that.
So we should be, based on where we are in the current cycle, headed into a cooling period, but we're going the other direction. Is that really the evidence that we need to be paying attention to?
Yeah, so the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which produces these big scientific reports on climate change every 6 or 7 years, and the cartoon book, the second edition, is based on the latest report, the IPCC AR6 report. So in a previous version of the report suggested that we were sort of heading towards another ice age. If we didn't have human emissions of CO2, anthropogenic activity, then we'd be heading towards another ice age, in the next 30,000 years or something like that. So 30,000 years is quite a long time relative to where we are today. There's I think there are folks who have pointed out, who sort of say, well, the scientists said that we're heading for an ice age, and now look, they're worried about global warming. But if you go back and look at the scientific literature, it's pretty consistent, right? We had this
absolutely, yeah,
very long-term warming, very long-term cooling projection if there was no human activity, but human activity is making a tremendous change in the short run, and arguably, like, human activity is interfering with that long-term natural cycle.
We are making a difference.
Yes. This was more of a positive difference.
Well, but the thing is, we could, and you talk about the fact that we can make that difference by lowering our emissions overall. You also go into at length what happens if we don't. What does the world look like after 2100 if we don't make a change in the next decade or two? It's tricky to answer that question, in part because we haven't been there, before. It's sort of an unknown world. If we get 3 or 4 degrees Celsius temperature increase, I think that there's the other challenge in that is that who knows what the rest of the world is going to look like in 2100 with technology. But in terms of physical impacts, you talk about sea level rise, for instance. Yep. Talk about the spreading of arid regions because of drought and so forth. Yeah. Do you see at this point, and in fact, we're speaking on the day that the new Democratic package to drive renewables investment has finally been announced. And so it sounds like a pretty good day for climate change in America. But do you see that program or anything that we're doing in general reshaping the direction that we're headed?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly steps that we could take to reduce carbon emissions and otherwise try to address climate change. And in some ways, like you said, with the package and it was just announced, so it's unclear exactly what's going to happen with it. But there certainly is a positive story you can tell where, for example, if we can clean up the electricity grid, mm-hmm. and then we can electrify the transportation system so that it relies on that clean electricity instead of petroleum fuels, mm-hmm. like, that's not everything that we need to do to tackle climate change, but it's a lot, right? Like that would be a tremendously positive story.
Well, and I think, it's slowly but surely we are starting to make this turn. It's just a question of whether or not we can accelerate it. And as an economist, do you see that kind of an investment? And again, we know very little about how this will actually play out. But when you put $368 billion, if I remember the number correctly, against incenting the adoption of new technology like renewables, does it work?
I mean, as an economist, I tend to prefer, what we call market-based instruments, things like carbon taxes, that's something that gives me more comfort. I think it's possible that these sorts of like subsidies for buying electric vehicles and subsidies for heat pumps and things like that, I think it's possible that it is possible that they will be a good step in the right direction.
And another issue, and you go into this into the book a bit, is this idea that taxes and government are just essentially bad is undercutting some of the important tools that we have to put those market-based incentives in place. Is that a short-sighted view, the idea that we have to leave it all to the market in the most laissez-faire sense, as compared to having government policy trying to push some of this activity?
Well, I mean, I think there's the idea that the market will kind of take care of it without any sort of government activity just ignores kind of basic economics about the tragedy of the commons and market failures. This is a well-known topic in the economics literature, that there are certain cases where Adam Smith's famous invisible hand doesn't work very well, and externalities like pollution, where your activities impact other people around the country, around the world. That's a classic example. I live in Salt Lake City. We have pretty bad air pollution in Salt Lake City. That's another kind of a local air pollution issue, and climate change is a global air pollution issue. So the idea that market forces just left to their own devices are kind of going to take care of it runs counter to basic economic theory. And I think what's really tragic about that, the political situation that we're in now, is that there are small government market-based approaches to climate change, and this is essentially what I've devoted it when I'm not telling jokes or writing cartoon books. This is sort of what I spend my time working on. Is we have, for example, I worked on a carbon tax ballot measure in Washington State in 2016, and our basic proposal was, let's have a carbon tax, let's cut the state's sales tax. So things that are carbon fossil fuel intensive are going to cost a little bit more. Everything else is going to cost a little bit less. And that's how we're going to do our part to save the world. And, we managed to get a grassroots group, managed to get this measure, Initiative 732, on the ballot in Washington State in 2016. And we lost because of sort of an unusual coalition of opposition from folks on the right who were afraid that it was socialism, and opposition from folks on the left who were mad that it wasn't. And so the opposition from folks on the right is, I think, it's terribly frustrating, because I think policies like that are sort of small government, market-based, pocketbook-friendly approaches. And there is a way forward down that path. And if you block that path, then you end up with, the only kind of option that's left are sort of these more bigger government approaches, kind of the Green New Deal kind of approach. I should mention, by the way, that I'm working on a measure here in Utah, since I live in Salt Lake City. We're working on a clean air and climate measure here that involves using revenue from a carbon tax to fund some local clean air programs, and to eliminate the state sales tax on grocery store food. Right? Like, would you rather?
Which is a regressive tax. And,
yes.
And so it would be easier on American families if we were to shift it to fossil fuels. Granted, fossil fuels contribute to food prices, but that by reducing the incentive to use fossil fuels, they're cheap, we improve the overall environment, both for the family and for the world.
Exactly. So our pitches were sort of, would you rather tax pollution or would you rather tax potatoes?
I think this is a great place to take a quick break. We're going to be right back to talk with Yoram Bauman. We're back to continue talking with Yoram Bauman. He's the author of The Cartoon Introduction to Climate Change. Now, Yoram, we were talking just before the break about the use of various market-based incentives and federal intervention. Now, you mentioned the tragedy of the commons earlier, the idea that everybody has access to this shared resource, our planet, but they all act in their own interest. And as a result, they run through the shared resource and leave nothing for anybody. When you look at the state of American politics, and we'll just stick to our country since we don't want to criticize everybody in the world at one time. Is this focus on self-reliance and independence and individuality that we have starting to kill us?
Well, I mean, it's a tough question, and as an economist, like I tend to economists tend to assume sort of the worst about people, right? Like we assume that people are self-interested in a very formal way. And one of the nice things about that is you get the benefits, the optimism that comes from low expectations, right? Like people always turn out to be better than we expect them to be. Like if your basic assumption is that people are just always looking out for number one, then people are often much better than that. I think the challenge really is that people are not the angels that maybe we would like them to be. And it's hard for me to see. It would be great if people were better people, but it's unclear how to make people better people. And so kind of as an economist, I kind of take things as they are and say, well, given that, people still want to drive around and fly around and not pay too much attention to the impacts of their actions on, people on the other side of the city, much less the other side of the planet, then what can we do collectively to try to address that? And it's a matter of, like Garrett Hardin said, it's mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, it's collective action. It's things like, well, we're all going to agree to pass a law that says that, that you're not supposed to idle your car, or, you have to take these actions that are going to improve air quality for everybody.
Well, so broadening the question a little bit, there's a lot of negotiation that has to happen between various groups on the planet and within the country. At the planetary level, the rich countries, which are also the most polluting countries, need to do something to help the lower income countries move forward. What does that negotiation look like? What are the key issues that you, looking at it from an economic perspective, think are going to make a difference when we finally find a way forward?
Well, there's kind of an easy path forward, and then there's a difficult path forward. The easy path forward, and this is what I spent a lot of my time as an economist kind of working on and pushing for, is one of the things that we're really good at in the rich countries in the world is we're really good at inventing new technologies. Mm-hmm. And so if we can come up with new technologies that are clean, right, that are alternatives to fossil fuels, if we can drive the price of wind and solar and batteries and electric vehicles down below the price of coal and natural gas and oil, right, then that's the easy story, because then the poorer countries in the world, the Indias and Pakistans and Africa, countries in Africa, right, will have an incentive to adopt those technologies, not because they're green, but just because they're cheap. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's the easy story. If we can drive the price of renewables down below the price of fossil fuels, then as I see it, then we win. Right.
So is the hard story waiting for the cost of the disasters to become so extreme that we simply have to take action? There's no alternative?
Well, the hard story is if there need to be additional financial payments, penalties, whatever, to encourage folks around the world to transition away from fossil fuels. And that becomes much harder because, the folks in India and Africa are saying, well, we've got, we're trying to put food on the table. Like, we've got these pressing issues. Like, we can't spend our precious few resources on these other technologies that cost more. Mm-hmm. And then you come to the rich countries like the US, and when I feel discouraged about climate issues, it's partly because in the US you also hear this same story about, well, we've got to put food on the table, so how can we afford to put money into helping folks in India or Bangladesh reduce their carbon emissions?
Well, this is also comes back to what you mentioned before, the notion of externalities. And for a lot of us, our worlds are defined pretty small. It's what's happening on my block, what's happening in my city, and maybe what's happening in my state at the broadest level for most people. We understand a lot more about our world. Do we have to factor that into all of our decisions? It sometimes feels like we can't do anything right because there are so many impacts. And again, your book does a good job of sort of laying all that out. how do you, for instance, address the problem of transitioning people who work in the fossil fuels industry so they can keep food on their table to the next economy? Or do we simply have to subsidize their retirement because they're not going to be prepared to move forward? I always wonder about these questions. I'd love to hear what you think.
Well, I mean, mostly as an economist, I tend to think that we should get the incentive structures right,
Okay.
and then the rest of it will follow.
How so? How do we do that?
Well, so there's a lot of value in looking at price signals, right? So prices convey a tremendous amount of information where, if carrots are expensive or carrots are cheap, then it tells you a lot about what's going on through that whole chain of production and transportation. And the great thing is that you as a consumer don't have to spend all your time thinking about like, well, how is this affecting people in other parts of the country or other parts of the world, right? You just sort of say, well, carrots are cheap, so I think I'll buy some more carrots. And the signals that are wrapped up in those market prices, if we could get them to convey the message that fossil fuels are costly and involve these, incorporate these external impacts on people around the world and people in future generations, then that's a shorthand way of getting people to pay attention to those impacts, even though it's hard to get people to say like, well, what are the impacts of my actions on people in other countries or people in future generations? But if you can put a signal into the price system through something like a carbon tax, then you can that's kind of a shortcut.
So again, this is the kind of question we get from our listeners all the time. About the carrot, for instance, is the carrot sustainably grown versus grown the industrial way, which is still wasteful, is a piece of information they're starting to try to consider. And so their shopping becomes a lot more complex as they go through this. Can we surface more information about our choices in order to better guide people towards the outcomes that won't lead to disastrous climate change? What can we do to help people understand that this really is a complex world, much bigger than the one that they like to acknowledge?
Well, I think you've got to take victories where you can find them. So I work on carbon taxes. Carbon taxes are not going to solve all of the problems in the world.
Sure.
But it's a step in the right direction. And so I think you got to take steps in the right direction where you can find them. And then you come back and you look at, okay, what else, what other steps do we need to take? But I think there is a danger of sort of saying, well, we can't solve any problem until we solve every problem. Because
absolutely, yes.
That's a recipe for just getting sort of stuck in quicksand.
Well, and the perfect is the enemy of progress, because it and to your point earlier about the left and the right coming together around fighting the carbon tax in Washington, both of them were asking for perfection, which was impossible. But so going back to the pricing, I'm at the grocery store. If I'm looking at the carrots and it says this carrot is $2 a pound and this carrot is $4 a pound, I don't have to know anything about why the difference is if the carrot that's $4 is taxed because it's carbon intensive. All of that has to happen in the background. Do you see real conversations going on, both in the economics community and across the economy, about integrating that kind of pricing mechanism in a serious way?
Well, there are certainly lots of discussions about carbon taxes and putting a price on carbon in a way that would send those kinds of signals throughout the economy. The challenge has been, in the political process, has not been very kind to carbon pricing lately. And
thank you, Vladimir Putin.
Well, the problem there is, the ideas that I work on are like, let's have a carbon tax, and then we can use the revenue to reduce other taxes, like the tax on grocery store food or the sales tax or payroll taxes. Al Gore had this line about how we should tax what we burn and not what we earn. Or you can use the money to invest in clean energy and things like that. The challenge with with energy prices going up because of Vladimir Putin is that, we don't get any of those benefits on the other side, right? They all go to the Vladimir Putins of the world.
And we've had enough of them, hopefully.
Yeah.
This also brings back the question to political leadership. And you point out in your book that one of the big successes that we've already had is the Montreal Protocol, which has resulted in the reduction in almost elimination of the ozone hole that was very famous in the 80s. I remember this well. Ronald Reagan signed on to the Montreal Protocol, and that changed everything in terms of ozone preservation. But he also, and I recall this very clearly, got skin cancer on his nose and linked that in his own mind to the ozone hole. It wasn't actually that accurate, but it was tangible for him. Do you see political leaders who really understand this? And I think this is a vital conversation for the United States right now, because everybody's saying there is no presidential candidate that I really feel good about. Do you see any leaders emerging who could have that kind of Reagan-esque impact, in the sense that they would join an international movement or at least do something significant here in the United States?
Well, there's the possibility that Congress is going to pass this new climate bill that was just announced yesterday, and so I think there are folks in the political system who are showing leadership, and I think there's a good number on the left, and I think there's even some folks on the right. So I live in Utah. Senator Mitt Romney, I think, has been very good on climate issues and saying that that's one of the top 3 challenges facing America. It's when you get into the question, well, what are the policy responses? Like, what are we going to do about it? That things get a little more challenging, not just, and I don't think it's fair to sort of, I don't think it's fair to blame the political leadership without saying that, if you talk to average Americans on the street, like, one of the challenges that those of us who care a lot about climate change face is that, the average person out there on the street probably doesn't care about climate change as much as, kind of we would like them to.
Well, but the data says that about 67% really do believe that the government has to do something, and 80 to 85% believe it's actually happening. So I do think that there's that public sentiment. But and this isn't about blaming the politicians. It's more about asking whether or not you see them understanding the tangible, palpable impact of climate change themselves and beginning to express it. Reagan took his skin cancer and projected it into international policy, basically. Do you see somebody like that emerging? Anybody? Left, right, center, doesn't matter.
Well, I mean, I think there are issues like wildfires in the American West. Mm-hmm. There's also been a lot of talk lately, since I'm here in Utah, about the drying up the Great Salt Lake. So there are water issues, there are fire issues. I continue to be amazed that folks in Florida are not more concerned about climate change, given sea level rise concerns there and elsewhere on the East Coast. So I do think there's the potential for those issues to sort of resonate with people in a tangible way, like you were talking about with Reagan and skin cancer. In some cases, there are scientific complications. I mean, fire issues in the American forests have this whole history with fire suppression and things like that. But in terms of getting into people's heads and saying, hey, this is something that we should pay attention to, I think there are some pretty strong candidates there.
Good. It's good to hear. So what finally is your advice for readers of the cartoon introduction? What do you think they should do personally to make a difference?
Well, I think there are things that you can do on an individual level, whether it's putting up solar panels or looking at an induction stove or a heat pump or something like that, or electric vehicles. So there's more and more choices that people can make as individuals. And then there's the collective choices that we make through the political process. So that's a matter of, reaching out to your state representatives, your federal representatives, and just saying that climate change is an important issue, and that you're keeping an eye on it and pushing for change.
I try to write a letter to a senator, to the president, to a governor every week, and it has at least I get mail back these days. It used to just go into an empty hole.
No, you get thank you notes. I'll also put in a plug since I work on ballot measures. I worked on this ballot measure in Washington State, and now I'm working on one, this Clean the Darn Air campaign in Utah, this clean air and climate measure. I think ballot measures are an amazing thing, right? Like, because the idea still blows me away after all these years. Like, if you collect a bunch of signatures from people, then you can get your policy idea on the ballot. And if enough people vote yes, then it becomes law. Like, that's just an amazing opportunity that we have in roughly half the states in the United States. And it's something that I think helps focus the mind, because then you have to think about, well, what can we put on the ballot that people will vote for?
Democracy is a great thing. Let's hope we keep it.
Amen.
All right. Hey, Yoram, thank you very much for taking time to talk with us today.
My pleasure, Mitch. Thank you so much. Good luck.
We've been speaking with Yoram Bauman. He's the world's only stand-up economist, and he's co-author with illustrator Grady Klein of the cartoon Introduction to Climate Change. The book is out in its second edition now. You know, just like that conversation, I think a lot of what we need to do together as both Americans and citizens of this world is encourage the conversation, and comedy and cartoons and storytelling, our personal storytelling, the things that we share with our friends, family, neighbors, and others is the basis for the beginning to move us forward. And I think it's already happening. It's good to see this conversation building, that people like Yoram are out there trying to encourage it. I hope you'll take a few minutes to share this podcast and all the others that we've done with your friends and family so that we can get the conversation going out there. More ideas are going to lead to less waste. This is Earth911, Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. We'll be back soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.